So I always think when I start to talk about evidence, it could be remarkably dull, so bear with me after the rousing talks and remarks from the speakers. But I did just want to reflect on, to push forward with the sorts of agendas that each of the colleagues have spoken about. I do think evidence matters, and of course I would say that as a researcher. And what you've been looking at on the screen, and so therefore I don't need to speak too much to it, is the sorts of issues that we looked at in the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, and really just this pulling together across the globe around all of these different issues. And the way I would describe that is we put together a global evidence base of the sorts of policies and practices and actions that could or should be taken. So quite normative, saying here's this big evidence around sorts of things that you could do in all of these different areas. What I think we didn't really do was, I don't think we got political around the data. I made a comment earlier about evidence being power, but we didn't really start to unpick some of the policy processes, the political processes in which evidence travels or not, in the different ways colleagues have commented. So this is purely a shameless plug for the work that myself and Fran and various colleagues in the room have been involved with, which is, we almost fell off our chairs when the National Health and Medical Research Council here in Australia funded this Centre for Research Excellence on the Social Determinants of Health and Health Equity. Because really, many people in the room would have critiqued NHMRC for funding the medical, not so much the health, or certainly the population health side of things. So things can change. Remember, I'm the person at this conference who's all about hope. Things can change if we can get the NHMRC to fund things like this. So I just wanted to give you a little flavour around this sort of data. And also a comment, I don't know if Evelyn is in the room, but a colleague here in Australia has been really calling for us to think about, I think she refers to it as health political science, so Evelyn Dulune's work, really getting very interdisciplinary, bringing together political scientists, anthropologists, we've got in this Centre for Research Excellence, public health people, sociologists, a whole suite of disciplinary minds thinking about these sorts of questions. Apologies, it's a wee bit small. But basically trying to unpick the policy processes, and yes, I know it's not a linear process. Please don't think that we think it all happens in that nice linear fashion. But looking at agenda setting, looking at policy coherence at the time of developing up policy, then trying to unpack some of the implementation challenges, and then the evaluation. So let me just go through that in a little bit. I'll spell that out in a little bit more detail. So there's the cycle that I'm referring to. So how do we get action on the social determinants onto the political and the social agenda? And if you just listen to the remarks from colleagues already, I think the answers are there. But we wanted to pull together some evidence, looking at some case studies within the Australian context, but of course this has relevance internationally as to how that might happen. So a number of the case studies, so the Medicare, paid parental leave, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and the Northern Territory emergency response. So things that exist, and well, I know the TPP doesn't exist, thank goodness, but something else will come in its place, don't worry. But understanding two case studies that we think are positively oriented towards social and health equity, and that would be Medicare and paid parental leave, and two case studies that most definitely are not, which would be the TPP and the Northern Territory intervention, and understanding how this issue of social and health equity travelled in and out of the policy-making processes. Who were the actors? Who were advocating for what? How were they doing it? How were they getting at the policy table? How were they being silenced, as Cassandra reminded us. So pulling together that sort of evidence. We hope that sort of evidence is going to be incredibly helpful, certainly for advocacy purposes, learning for how to sort of duck and dive, as it were, in the policy agenda setting processes. The second aspect of the CRE is looking at policy development. So what does policy look like that really thinks about health equity? And we're doing this in a very real-time fashion. At the moment in South Australia, so in the state of South Australia, there is the closure of the Holden factory is about to take place. That really comes at a time of big deindustrialization for the state, as is the case in many places around the world. Now, of course, with that comes a whole load of policy responses specifically for the closure, but of course, just generally, policy is always happening. And how these different policies are operating together in a complementary way, in a not complementary, I've just made up some English, in a coherent or incoherent way. And so the idea of trying to understand this policy environment as a complex system and how out of that will come health inequities, health equity. So that's one way of thinking about policy coherence through a systems lens. That is what we're starting to look at the moment. Again, I don't expect you to be able to understand that. But how do you make sense of that in a way that's good for social well-being? Then, of course, the big million-dollar question of, okay, well, we might have policy that is good, looks as if it might be good for health and addressing some of the structural issues, thinking about some of those upstream factors. What happens when it comes into that implementation stage? And you're interested in that question of lifestyle drift or coming back to the individual responsibility. So you might have a sort of policy that's addressing something to do with the wider food system or the wider food environment, and yet in practice we still give leaflets to people to tell them what to eat without doing anything about the wider environment. So what is it that's happening within that implementation stage, some of the systems processes, and of course the actors, the people who are, it suits their interests to not have action taking place. I'm talking about the food system. It could be a whole variety of systems. It suits them very much to keep the focus on the leaflets and the individual responsibilities. So these are some of the case studies that we're looking at in that implementation stage. And you might say, why on earth would we be interested in the National Broadband Network? What on earth has that got to do with health? Well, of course, digital inequities. Given that now much of people's information about health services, social services is online, if you don't have access to if it's not accessible and if it's not easily usable, then that's a major inequity in place. Land use, primary health care, and the closing the gap strategy. So who are the actors? What are the different values that the different actors bring, the way that they construct the populations who are experiencing these policies, and how are the systems working to make these policies good or bad for health? And then that fourth point around policy evaluation, and this was really kind of in response to, in the Commission on Social Determinants, we were often being asked, so I spend a lot of time doing stuff around trade and investment and what that means for health, and often being asked, well, really, how does trade, what's that got to do with health? Show me the evidence. And I can show you a lovely conceptual diagram. I can give you a lot of qualitative evidence as to how trade matters for a whole load of things. But still, the colleagues in the Ministries for Trade are sitting across the table saying, show me the numbers. We would fool ourselves to think that the numbers don't matter. So what we're trying to do is, in these big policy issues that I've highlighted throughout the CRE, is see if we can produce some numbers so that we've got a combination of quantitative and qualitative evidence around how these different policies and programs affect health equity. And it's very, very early days with that piece of work. We're really trying to think about things like systems modelling, natural policy experiments, a whole suite of terminology that I just can't even pronounce out loud, so we'll come back to when that's done. So I just wanted to acknowledge my colleagues. There's some of the research team there, and we have a wider group of associate investigators around the world. So I hope we'll be producing this evidence in, I hope, in sort of real-time way that we will be sharing publicly for use, for advocacy purposes, for people within government trying to understand those issues of breaking down silos. What does it mean for the practitioners around the implementation challenges? And then, of course, for those of you who want those numbers, that you find those numbers useful in certainly holding institutions to account. So thanks.